Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with us this afternoon. This next conversation is one that I hold near and dear to my heart. This conversation is about data, measurement, and how we can get the right numbers to attribute to the success of women's sports, because that's really the only way to truly grow it. We have a really interesting lineup. So first, I want to bring up Megan Clarken, who's the CEO of Criteo, one of the biggest publicly traded ad tech companies. Megan is a former track and field Olympic athlete. How amazing is that to have someone who is not only a media expert, but also gets the sport, which is absolutely incredible. We have Megan's old colleague, Deirdre Thomas, who is the current Chief Product Officer of Nielsen, also joining us on stage. You all probably know Nielsen, but if you don't, Nielsen is the company that does all of the big TV ratings. So anytime you get a notice that the NCAA Women's March Madness finale broke records, that is Nielsen's data that is giving you that. And last but definitely not least, we have Angela Ruggiero, who is the co-founder of the Sports Innovation Lab. She's also a 4-time Olympian and gold medalist. Thank you all for being here today. What a rare combination to have business executives with sports experience. And Deirdre, even if it's not for you, being an Olympian, you have been managing data around sports for a long, long time. So then maybe let's start there. There has been so much attention towards the women's game and how much it's grown. Obviously, Nielsen tracks television viewership. But walk us through other places in media where women's sports coverage and engagement is growing.
Sure. So our business is to measure the landscape and everything that the consumer consumes. We're most known for television, but we measure across all devices, phones, tablets, laptops. I won't bore you with the names of the products in which we measure those things, but we can bring all of that together to provide a comprehensive view of viewership of any video program, including women's sports. And we've been doing that for as long as, for all the events that have been out there, but it's certainly exploded of late. And there's a lot of catching up to do. We've been measuring it, and data really helps, which is what we're going to talk about today. But I think that there's still a ton of room to properly value the audiences that are interested in sports. And just one data point to illustrate that, Nielsen's sports business, which focuses on sports, all aspects of it, but they did research and looked at the value of the Women's Super League in Europe, a European soccer group. They found $23 billion. Well, those rights sold for $7 billion. So it's undervalued by 2.5, right? So there's just a lot of room in this industry for growth.
In terms of figuring out those valuations, what are the things that you look at when you're trying to evaluate what a women's sports team is worth?
So this is not the part of the business I run, but I will butcher it a little bit for you. They do a combination of analysis about the audience, the characteristics of the audience that consume that sport, and the fandom sort of, and the actual participation in that sport in the market. Yeah.
When we're talking about fandom, where do you find that most women are engaging with sports content? Is it on their phones on social, following athletes? Is it watching the game? Where's the momentum?
Well, I think it's on all of it. I think a big aspect of sports, and we saw it on the panel earlier when you were up here with Kiki and all, people love the story of the athletes. It's actually very intimidating to be on stage with these women because that's a huge part of it. So I think that drives a lot of the social and the full experience of following an athlete or following a team. But sports, people like to watch sports on the big screen. I think people will watch it on their phone if they have to, so they don't miss whatever it is they want to see. But sports is a big screen kind of experience typically.
Megan, you worked with Deirdre at Nielsen, so you have seen the evolution.
She was my boss.
She was your boss. You have seen the evolution of sports content consumption from being something that you could only do on TV to something then that now you can do on iPads and on mobile, et cetera. And while Deirdre's right, people like to watch the full game on a big screen, they're doing so much else on that second screen. How has that viewership habit changed in your career in media?
Well, can I jump off media just for 1 second? Because
Yeah.
I think it's really important to point something out, that we are in such an important part in our evolution in terms of access to data. So as a sports person, I'm going to, show my age. I'm 12 years old. But I competed in the 80s on the world stage, and there was no data. There was no data in terms of audiences, but most importantly, there was no data in terms of your own performance as an athlete. We had a stopwatch, and that was it. And even worse, you couldn't tell what your competitors were doing across the other side of the world because there was no internet and there was no data flowing through. And even worse, we kind of mirror where we are today, where I competed against East Germany and USSR, and we might call them walled gardens today, but back then we called them iron curtains, and the athletes that were coming out of that part of the world were extraordinary. Their performances were partly because of the data that they had access to. So now it's all open, and we use data for performance as athletes, and you can see the changes in the shape of the sports landscape because of it. For audiences, it's just, well, for athletes, it's critically important to use that and extend on that to create their own brand. They are the content, and to use themselves to generate income. Because in my time, when I retired, I had to go find a job, which many athletes have to go do, and a lot of the time it's inventing themselves around the data, themselves as content. And that requires really understanding how to generate audiences, how to attract brands to those audiences, how to measure them and get data across different devices, and how to continue that cycle so that actually they can protect themselves and their data to own that space, own that brand, and own that business. And I don't know if that answered your question, but I just felt like...
Well, no, it's huge. I mean, my boss and longtime mentor has his son here, and one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of the data evolution is I've known and have worked with him for over a decade, and when we were first thinking about how do we drive our audience, the data that we were transacting on then is laughable compared to what we have now. And we wouldn't have been able to build our business today if it wasn't for access to that. But thinking about the end consumer, Angela, running Sports Innovation Lab, you know the data of the fan. You know the data of the consumer. You know the data around the brands. Like, what does that show in terms of the growth of the women's sports fan base?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I founded a company called Sports Innovation Lab. We are a fan data provider. We really use purchasing data, partnerships, a number of different sources to help you understand your consumer. And I was blown away. Again, 4-time Olympian. I sat on the executive board of the IOC. I was sitting in all these rooms realizing we didn't actually at our core know who our fan was. And when you're thinking about build by partnerships, strategy, like you have to start with your consumer. And so that's where Sports Innovation Lab started. And as we did work, we were a few years into the company, I said, I don't want to be a part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution as we're helping the NFL and other, male sports properties. So we started what we call the Fan Project, which Sarah Spain over here could tell you about. She's an expert. But it was really, can we unearth, and instead of hitting the heart, can we hit the head? Because as marketers and brands and media partners wanted to move into this place with more security and confidence, we said, let's stop talking about it, you should, and guilt trip. Let's actually say, here's the market and the business of women's sports. And back to the fan base, what we found is fans of women's sports, and that's men and women, right? It's about a 55-45 blend, they're more tech savvy, they spend more money, they're more loyal. They're literally check, 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 check. There might be less of them now, but we have this community growth score, acquisition and retention of the fan base, 40% greater on the women's side than on the men's side. So you have this avid fan base that loves the athletes, that's dying for more product. We run out of product on the merch side. We don't have enough content on the media side. Sponsors are dipping their toe, but should be more aggressive. And we're at Sports Innovation Lab attempting to give you confidence that this market is here. You should spend more money, and that it's growing at a much higher clip than the men's side. So it's just, the data to me is everything, because I'm just sick and tired of waiting. And as an athlete, I'm like, what the fuck? I'm a great product. Why don't I have the platform? Why don't this new generation have that platform? Let's hit the market over the head with data. You can't argue with that. And if we can do that we can move businesses. And that's what we're seeing today. Everyone's, oh, Caitlin Clark, she's amazing, but like there was like a ton of athletes and a ton of products. So I get really passionate about it because I love this conversation. We need the data to move the market.
In terms, yes, let's get a round of applause for that. Absolutely. In terms of the type of data, I love the examples that you provided. They're more tech savvy, they spend more, they're more loyal. How do you identify what are the types of metrics that we need to be looking at? Because obviously, as we were saying before, for a long time it was just viewership.
Yeah.
You're talking about very different types of data. So what are the types outside of what you mentioned that we need to be focusing on more?
Well, we like to look at survey grade as date is fantastic, but like viewership is fantastic because it's like volume. And again, you put women's sports on TV where everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe the ratings. I'm like, yeah, I can believe the ratings. Like you put it in primetime finally. You invested in, appointment television. You've kind of eased the fan. It's hard to be a women's sports fan. It's hard not to be a men's sports fan, right? So I love that. But what we're trying to do is transactional data, more like, oh, you become a sponsor of women's sports, we can actually show you the increase in spend. And when marketers can see that, like I have ROI now attached to my spend. Again, that's a lot of what we try to do is like, did they buy something? Did they buy your product? And on the women's sports side, 3 times the the brand affinity. So we're coming out with this stuff. Fan Project, if you haven't checked it out, it's all in there. But it's like, yo, this is a great deep fan base that loves these women, loves this product. Like you should feel good about it. So I think there's no one source. I think it's an amalgamation of all these sources put together. That if you're in one part of the industry, you'll hopefully it'll resonate. And again, we're really focused on the end, which is like, did you spend money? Did you buy a ticket? Did you buy a jersey? Did you buy a product of the brands that are coming into this space?
Yeah, can I build on that? So for us, it's all about conversion, everything, because the dollars come with a commercial sale, and the brands want to know that the audience is there, but ultimately, did the audience buy something? Have they transacted? Have they done something? And there's a turning of the tide right now, which is shifting brands from going for large audiences to going for very niche audience that actually convert. And that's when you're sort of around the streets listening to what's going on here at Cannes, the messaging around going from big, broad brand advertising across social media networks. How many times out there are you seeing Roundel? And are you seeing the big retailers that are now becoming media properties because they're advertising close to the product, close to the point of sale, and they have access to the best measurement that you can get, this closed-loop measurement on their site. And they have first-party data about the loyalty of the customer who's actually made that purchase. That is so gold compared to just a measurement of this is how big the audience was to a particular social site or to linear TV. Now, I know linear has got many redeeming elements to it, but in terms of getting to conversion, that's the best way to go.
When we think about measurement today, Deirdre, it is so bifurcated in some cases. So if you think about linear, let's take the latest NWSL rights, which is the National Women's Soccer League. They have an amazing historic package, $240 million, but it's split across essentially 5 entities, which being Scripps, CBS, Amazon, and the NWSL's like own O&O property, and ESPN. So what does that mean in terms of measuring audience engagement when you're not only trying to track it across all these different networks on linear, but now throw in some streaming, now throw in some digital viewership on clips? Like, how does Nielsen even count what loyalty looks like when it's so bifurcated?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We always start, I said this before too, we always start with the consumer. What is the consumer doing and how do we best measure that for the publishers as well as for the advertisers? So when I talk about television these days, I don't ever talk about linear because none of us sit down to watch linear. We sit down to watch television, and that's maybe ESPN, it may be Peacock, it may be YouTube. So when I think about measuring it, I think about measuring video and providing a video rating, and that's the direction that Nielsen is going, which encompasses pretty much everything that you said. And I think that data tells really powerful story. I wanted to jump in and add some of the things that you were saying. You know, viewers of female sports are 60% likely to recommend the sponsors, the brands that sponsor that sport that they care about. That's really high. They're also more affluent, and we know this because we know a lot about all of our panelists, and we measure across all these different devices and touch points, and they're more affluent. And they remember ads more. They're actually, in one study, it was shown that viewers of women's sports are more than twice as likely to recall an ad than somebody in men's sports. So there's all this data to tell the story about why there's ROI to be had by investing in women's sports. And it's not just the audience, although I have tons of stats about the growth of the audience itself too. It's also who's watching is a really great audience.
Angela, we have all the data, to your point, that shows this is a good investment. And yet there are still brands that can look at all of the data and choose to sit out. I think in part because they are just doing what they've done historically over and over, and they're unwilling to take the risk. What types of brands have you found are more likely to take the leap into women's sports? Is it a specific type of category? Is it the age of a brand? Is there no through line at all?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Who's in charge? Who's writing the check? What does that person look like? Do they look like a man or a woman? I take Andrea Bremer at Ally, who pledged 50% of her marketing budget. And overnight, I mean, her CEO is reporting this to their shareholders, saying this is like one of the best investments we've ever made to make that decision to equally spend. Now, we can get into, like, is there enough inventory? But, you know, I think the premise is, do you have a man at the top that's willing to take the risk? So we're like, here's the data so you can cover your ass. Or you believe, and this isn't charity, this is like ROI. This is a good investment. And women, I think, are more convinced. You don't have to tell us. It's more of, can we, at Sports Innovation Lab and others that exist, empower you to make those decisions, again, more confidently. So I don't think there's a generic category, if I had to answer your question. I think it's more of the leadership at the top. Do they see this market? Is there enough data summarized? And that's what we've been trying to do with the FAN project. And I've been on my soapbox, you know, pounding people, elbowing them, throwing my, you know, slap shot in their face if they don't listen. But it's, can we empower them? They already have, you know, they're getting over the hit over the heart. And more women, I think, move in, and I'm just going to say it, more men that have confidence, or more women that are like, there's a market here, and I'm just going to move into it. And that's what I think is will be the turning point. I think we did a survey last year with our women's sports club. 10% of, on average, budgets go on the brand side to women's sports. 83% of the people in our club are committed to spending more. That might be 1% more. That might be, you know, 50% more. So we're moving in the right direction, and I hope these kinds of conversations allow those brands to get there quicker.
Can I just point to a couple of things that actually illustrate that there's more room, of course, but that it's happening? Ad spend on women's sports was 6x in 2023 than it was in 2022. In 2022 was 6x 2021. So it is happening. And if you look at NIL was 52 out of the top 100 deals were women this past year versus 38 the prior year. So we're seeing it start to happen, and we're seeing it in the ratings as well. But absolutely, I don't think it's because people are, I don't think it's altruism or a sense of right. I think people are looking at data and realizing,
and that's
wow,
what they
this
should
is
be doing it.
Megan, as a former athlete, you talked about not having access to the data on the performance side. Did it ever occur to you, did you ever think about how data would have informed the growth of the sport from a commercial perspective, having more data around engagement and around fandom? Or was that just so not even part of the conversation at the time?
No, it's like being a snail. You know, a snail only knows what's in front of them. If you've never seen data before, you don't know that it's out there. And so it's not until things started to happen, where measurement started to happen, and you were following what was happening from other countries, that's why I talk about other countries, that this just became something that you had access to use. And this whole conversation has evolved like enormously in the last 20 or 30 years. And now we're getting to a point where we're trying to evolve it to what is the thing, the magic thing that equalizes, the men's sport to the women's sport. And yes, it has moved a long way, but there are systemic issues here. And the only thing I can point to is within my own company, pay parity. I know I'm going off course again, but in terms of systemic issues, pay parity, we now have, I put pay parity in my company, I have had it for 3 years. But when I question others, they say, I'm not going to do it because it costs too much. I say, okay, I've got a really simple method for you. You just decrease the pay of the men. And, and this is what happens. People laugh. And so people laughing means there's a systemic issue here that says, I'm not really going to take that seriously. And this is everywhere, and it's through sport. And we just have to keep pushing, keep plugging, keep doing the work that we're doing to make change. But it will happen.
I agree. I think that's why we're here today, is because we have confidence that it's going to happen. That's why we're investing in this programming. Just a few of the big takeaways from today. Deirdre, you were saying there's a lot of catching up to do, but there's really a lot of room in properly valuing sports. You noted that the Women's Super League was undervalued by $2.5 billion. The hope is that with more data, that never happens. I'm very curious to see how the WNBA rights shake out and to see if they get some fair value for the monster viewership that we know is on the way and has already existed. We talked a little bit about the importance of the evolution of data. Megan said that we're at this really important, critical point. You competed in the 80s only with a stopwatch, no data, no internet, and then Russia came along and you said, wow, that's what it looks like when you have really good data and you can compete. I love that you said it was the Iron Curtain and now they're walled gardens. That resonated with me a lot. Angela, you were saying you didn't know who the fan was. You didn't know who the consumer was. That's why you started the Fan Project. And instead of sort of hitting the heart, it's about hitting the head. It's not charity. It's about good business, which I think has been a big through line through a lot of what we've been discussing about today. Data drives the market. Another really good takeaway from Angela. In terms of the disparity between men's and women's sports, Angela said, it is hard to be a women's sports fan. It's hard not to be a men's sports fan. And I think that is perfect examples, particularly in terms of where the rights are going and how you can actually get access and view things. It's all about, Megan said, conversions, finding which audiences are actually going to buy or transact or sell or attend something. And to that point, Deirdre was saying about the consumer, they are on so many different channels that we have to be able to measure all of them, particularly in women's sports. They do a lot of storytelling on digital. And then sort of the last thing, when we think about data, the fact that 52 of the top 100 women NIL deals, 52 of the top 100 NIL deals were women versus men, up from 38 the year prior, shows that momentum is definitely happening today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stay tuned because we got 2 more awesome conversations. And please give a round of applause for Angela, Deirdre, and Megan.